This is Let Your Voice Be Heard, right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
Worst song ever written.
That is the best song ever written.
The worst song.
I was at the club, and it only got 5 likes. Should I take it down?
That's actually really funny, and maybe I've done that before.
Well, so speaking of whether or not you can access the internet, or whether or not your internet service provider is going to charge you more money to get onto your favorite websites, like Facebook or Twitter or any of these other things, today during the Quickie, we're talking about the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission. Their new rules that they proposed on how the internet is going to be regulated. Essentially, this is a concept known as net neutrality. Obviously, we've done several quickies on net neutrality before, so I'm going to give you a kind of a brief on what net neutrality is, and then I'm going to get more into actually the proposed rules, because that's what really this quickie is about. If you're interested in knowing more about the nuts and bolts of net neutrality, then head to our website, www.letyourvoicebeheard. Head to the place where our old shows are posted, and then you can do a search. You can find the old quickies. You can get all the information you need on net neutrality. So this week, the chairman of the FCC proposed the quote-unquote strongest open internet protections that the web has ever seen. He would do this by regulating the internet as if it was a public utility. I'm going to get into what that means in just a second. Quickly, what is net neutrality? Net neutrality is the idea that internet service providers such as Time Warner, Verizon, etc., Comcast shouldn't be allowed to block or to degrade access to certain websites or to services, nor should they be allowed to set up quote-unquote fast lanes that allow content to be favored by certain internet service providers to load more quickly than the rest, depending on how much money you're willing to pay. This has always been explained sort of in the Netflix context, that essentially if you had the regular internet, then Netflix would load really, really slow, and it would just buffer, and you'd have to wait like hours in order to buffer your show to watch it. But if you had money and you wanted to pay for the faster lane, then you could pay to essentially have a fast lane service, and then your Netflix would load right away. And so it would create a disparity where anytime you wanted to get onto a website, the more you were willing to pay, the faster you could access that website, and people who couldn't afford to pay or weren't willing to pay wouldn't be able to. People who are activists for the internet hate this plan because they say it destroys the idea of a free and open internet, and they point to examples like Twitter, like Facebook, and say these things could never have existed if we would have regulated the internet the way that, internet service providers and Republicans think that we should do, which is essentially to allow these internet service providers to do whatever they want. So what does it mean to regulate the internet as a public utility? First, you have to understand what's known as reclassification. Right now, telecommunication services like traditional phone lines, they're considered common carriers. What that means is that the law imposes a wide variety of legal obligations on them, and it gives the FCC broad range of discretion to regulate them. Whereas information services are, where people are allowed to store, publish information online. In 1996, that meant services like AOL, which obviously we know sort of doesn't really exist anymore in its same capacity, because you don't need a program to get online anymore. You can just get online directly through your internet service provider. And so right now, these services are exempt from FCC regulations. That's what sets up this problem. So by reclassifying the internet as a public utility, that would mean that it would be considered a telecommunication service, and it would allow the FCC to strictly regulate companies like Verizon, Comcast, and Time Warner, and other companies that provide internet service to people like you and me, and allow the government to step in and say, like, no, you can't do this. You can't throttle service. You can't charge people more to get on the net. You can't charge people more to get onto certain websites. So the FCC's chairman, Tom Wheeler, said that by placing broadband internet providers such as Comcast and Verizon under strict regulatory regimes, customers would be ensured an open internet. Under the new regime, broadband providers would be explicitly banned from blocking content or from creating these so-called fast lanes that I just talked about, and giving preferential treatment to people who could pay for it. Tom Wheeler, he's the FCC's chairman, he said he wants to regulate internet providers with the most aggressive tool that he has, which is Title II of the Communication Act. In addition to covering fixed broadband providers such as Comcast and Time Warner, he said that the new rules that he would draft would also cover wireless providers such as T-Mobile and Sprint, because you have to remember a lot of people get online through their phones. A lot of people who don't have internet coming into their home, they access the internet through their cell phone, and therefore, you have to include not just regular internet service service providers like your Time Warners, your Verizons, and your Comcast, but also wireless web providers such as T-Mobile and Sprint. So they would come under the rules also. And the rules would make speeding up or slowing down web traffic, which is a tactic that's known as prioritization, it would make that illegal. It would also ban the blocking of web traffic outright. So essentially, these communication providers couldn't say, you can't access Netflix unless you pay us $9.99 extra a month. The other thing that it would do is it would keep key provisions of Title II of the Communications Act, and it would allow the FCC to enforce consumer privacy rules, extract funds from Internet service providers to help subsidize Internet services for rural Americans that don't have the kind of access to the Internet that we have here in urban centers like New York City. And it would allow them to use that money towards making sure that educators of poor students can have Internet in their classroom. It would also take some of the money that they would get from the Internet service providers, and it would use it for services such as Google Fiber, which would allow Google to build new broadband, and that essentially would increase our access for everybody to get online. Things like free public Wi-Fi. You're starting to see that go up here in New York City a lot, but it's really important because you have to remember people who are on food stamps or living in public housing, a lot of times they don't have the money to be able to pay to have internet in their home, and so they end up in internet dead zones where there's no free Wi-Fi and there's no way for them to pay for internet. This would take some of the money that we would get from these big providers and allow us to create free internet access in a lot of poorer communities, which is especially beneficial in places like Harlem, certain parts of Brooklyn, certain parts of the Bronx that are essentially, they refer to like food deserts, but these are kind of like internet deserts.
Right.
Another thing that's really important is that the draft proposal would apply to the backbone of the internet, which is the part of the web that's responsible for carrying web traffic. It's the kind of stuff that you don't see behind closed doors. It would also apply to that. It wouldn't just apply to the stuff that you see on the surface. Under the new rules, the FCC could also investigate shady deals like the one that Netflix signed with Comcast or like the ones that Verizon signs with certain websites, because those would be something that the government could regulate under the new rules. The announcement reflects a major turning point for internet regulation. It's a huge movement in the history of the web because the proposed rules stand to determine who and how internet providers are allowed to charge for services and whether they can. Of course, the proposal has Republican critics as well as internet providers really pissed off for two reasons. One, internet providers are not sure what new rules they're going to come under, and they see this as like more government regulation, which of course means that they're going to raise their costs and want to pass those costs off to you. So they're like, under these new rules, we're going to end up charging you more anyway. And of course, Republicans hate it because they're like, oh my God, the federal government is grabbing power again. Alarm, 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 Obama. Yeah. Sound the alarm. But, the other thing you should know that is even if these regulations pass, internet providers are still going to take these rules to court. They're going to challenge them. They have in the past. They will in the future. They're going to argue that FCC has ceded their executive authority and that they don't have the power to regulate the internet and a whole host of other legal challenges. But these proposed rules are much more aggressive than, what people had initially predicted. They were really concerned when Tom Wheeler was appointed because he worked for a big cable provider. They thought that he was going to be on the side of cable providers. But it turns out that all of this adds up to the most significant intervention that has ever been taken by the federal regulators to make sure that the web remains a level playing field, remains open and accessible to all of us.
Yeah.
And on that note, thank you. And on that note, unfortunately, we have to go to our week-long break, and we will be back next week. And you can join us again at 11 a.m. This is Let Your Voice Be Heard Radio on WHCR. Have a great afternoon.
WHCR 90.3 FM.